Imagine being considered too cruel by people who thought public executions were family entertainment. Today, we're going to explore something that made even the most hardened medieval executioners say, "Nah, that's a bit much." But before we dive into history's most inhuman punishments, I need to warn you, this isn't just another video about medieval torture devices. This is a story about human creativity gone wrong. Very wrong. You see, throughout history, humans have proven themselves to be absolutely brilliant at two things: creating art and inflicting suffering. Sometimes, disturbingly often actually, they combine both. What you're about to learn isn't just a collection of gruesome facts. It's a journey into the darkest corners of human ingenuity. A reminder that long before we invented smartphones or landed on the moon, we were inventing increasingly creative ways to make each other suffer. Let's start with what might be history's most horrifying punishment, Brazen Bull, a punishment so horrific that even its inventor ended up experiencing it firsthand. Its creator, Perillos of Athens, thought he'd hit the jackpot when he presented his invention to the tyrant Phalaris. It was a hollow bronze bull, sized to fit a human inside. The victim would be locked inside, and a fire would be lit underneath. But here's the artistic part. The bull's head was designed with an acoustic device that converted the victim's screams into the sound of an angry bull's roar. Phalaris was impressed, very impressed, so impressed that he decided the first person to test it should be Perillos himself. Talk about quality control. And that's the thing about these punishments. They weren't just about causing pain. They were performance art. Horrible, twisted performance art. But we're just getting started. Ever heard of the rat torture? No? Well, not the cute little ones you might keep as pets. No, we're talking about medieval rats. The ones that spread the plague and apparently gave medieval torturers some very creative ideas. The rat torture, also known as the rat torture device, was a remarkably simple yet terrifyingly effective method that made use of our natural fear of rodents. Here's how it worked. And yes, this was a real punishment documented in multiple historical sources. The executioner would place a large rat on the victim's body, usually the stomach or chest area. Then they'd put a metal bucket over the rat. Simple enough, right? Well, here's where human creativity kicks in. They would then heat the top of the bucket. The rat, trying to escape the increasing heat, would have only one way to go: down. And by down, I mean through the victim's body. But perhaps what's most fascinating about this torture method isn't its brutality, it's its psychology. You see, the torture wasn't just physical. The victim would feel and hear the rat's desperate attempts to escape. They'd know exactly what was coming. The anticipation itself was part of the torture. Speaking of psychological torture, let's talk about something that makes the rat torture look almost humane: Chinese water torture. Now, I know what you're thinking. Water torture? How bad could that be? Well, hold on to that thought. Picture this. You're strapped down, completely immobilized. A drop of water falls on your forehead, then another, and another, at precise intervals. For hours, days even. Sounds annoying but manageable, right? Wrong. The Chinese water torture was so effective that it could drive people insane within hours. The consistency of the drops, the inability to move, the anticipation of the next drop, it all worked together to break down the human psyche. But here's the truly fascinating part. Modern scientists have actually studied this torture method. They found that the water drops created a type of cavity in the skull's periosteum, leading to an excruciating headache that would get worse with each drop. Now, let's shift gears to something that combines both physical and psychological torture: Judas' cradle. Named after the betrayer of Jesus, the Judas cradle was essentially a pyramid-shaped seat. The victim would be placed on top of it and slowly lowered down. The point would, well, you can probably imagine. But here's what makes it particularly clever and horrifying. The torture could last for days because the victim's own body weight determined how quickly they were lowered. The executioners would sometimes add weights to the victim's legs or oil the device to speed up the process. Other times, they'd lift the victim up slightly and let them fall back down. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect, the victim could technically stop the torture at any time by standing up on their tiptoes. But eventually, exhaustion would set in, and this brings us to an important point about medieval torture. It wasn't just about causing pain. It was about breaking the spirit. Take the breaking wheel, for example, also known as the Catherine wheel. It wasn't just a method of execution. It was a public spectacle that could last for days. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and their limbs would be broken in specific places. The skilled executioner would ensure the victim stayed alive through the whole process. Then the wheel would be mounted on a pole, and the victim would be left there. Birds would peck at them, the sun would burn them, and they'd be fully conscious for most of it. But here's the twist. Sometimes the executioner would perform the coup de grace, blow of mercy, where they'd break the victim's chest or neck, causing a quicker death. This wasn't out of kindness. It was another form of control. The ability to grant mercy was just as powerful as the ability to cause pain. Ever wondered what happens when you combine religious fervor with Viking brutality? Let's talk about the blood eagle, a punishment so horrific that some historians refuse to believe it was real. Picture this: 9th century Scandinavia. You've just killed a Viking king. Bad choice. Very bad choice. The punishment? They cut open your back, break your ribs so they spread out like wings, and then pull your lungs out to the openings while you were still alive. But here's the truly fascinating part. This wasn't just about causing pain. It was about denying the victim entry to Valhalla. You see, Vikings believed that to enter Valhalla, a warrior had to die bravely in battle. The blood eagle forced them to lie face down, the most humiliating position for a Viking warrior. Historical records suggest this was actually performed on several people, including King Aello of Northumbria, though he probably wished it was just a myth. Speaking of myths, let's talk about something that sounds like it came from a horror movie but was very real: the lead sprinkler. Imagine a metal container shaped like a holy water sprinkler, except instead of holy water, it contained molten lead, boiling oil, or boiling water. The torturer would sprinkle the contents on different parts of the victim's body. They often started with the eyes, but what makes this particularly interesting is how it was often used during the Spanish Inquisition. They literally used an object shaped like a holy instrument to inflict unholy amounts of pain. The irony doesn't stop there. Have you heard of the pear of anguish? Despite its fruity name, this was one of the most feared devices in medieval Europe. It was a metal instrument shaped like a pear that could be inserted into any orifice, mouth, rectum, or vagina. Then it would be slowly opened using a screw mechanism. But here's what's truly fascinating. Archaeologists have never found a genuine medieval pear of anguish. Some historians believe it was more of a psychological torture device, something to threaten people with rather than actually use. Sometimes, the threat of torture was more effective than torture itself. Now, let's talk about something that definitely existed. Ever wondered what it takes for humans to collectively say, you know what? Maybe we've gone too far with this whole torture thing. Welcome to the fascinating story of how some of history's most brutal punishments finally met their end. But first, let's talk about probably the most humane invention for execution: the guillotine. Yes, you heard that right. The head chopping machine was actually created to make execution more humane. Talk about setting a low bar. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin proposed it in 1789 as a way to make death quick and equal for all social classes. Before this, nobles got the privilege of a quick axe to the neck, while commoners often endured much worse. Guillotin was actually against the death penalty. He just wanted to make it less painful while he worked on getting it abolished. His family was so embarrassed by the association that they changed their name. But here's where things get really interesting. Remember all those horrifically creative torture methods we discussed? Most of them didn't end because people suddenly became kinder. They ended because they stopped being useful. Take the breaking wheel. It wasn't banned because it was cruel. It was banned because public execution started causing riots instead of fear. In 1757, the torture of Robert Francois Damiens, who attempted to assassinate Louis XV, backfired spectacularly. The public, instead of being terrified, became sympathetic to the victim. Turns out, watching someone suffer for hours isn't great for maintaining social order. Who knew? But perhaps the most fascinating shift happened during the Enlightenment period. Philosophers started asking uncomfortable questions, like, hey, maybe torturing someone until they confess isn't the most reliable way to get the truth. Cesare Beccaria's 1764 essay on crimes and punishments was particularly devastating. He basically said, if we want less crime, maybe we should focus on preventing it rather than finding creative ways to punish it. Revolutionary thinking, right? But here's the real kicker. Torture didn't just stop working as a deterrent. It started making martyrs. Remember those Christian martyrs who were fed to lions? Their brutal deaths actually helped spread Christianity. Oops. The same thing happened during the witch trials. The more creatively cruel the punishments became, the more people started questioning the whole system. By the 18th century, something unusual started happening. People began seeing public executions as entertainment. They'd bring picnics. Children would watch. And that's when the authorities realized they had a problem. When your horrible death penalty becomes a family day out, it's probably lost its deterrent effect. But let's talk about the most surprising reason these punishments ended: bureaucracy. Turns out, maintaining torture chambers is expensive. You need skilled torturers, yes, that was a job, specialized equipment, and somewhere to store it all. When modern prison systems came along, they were just more cost-effective, less dramatic, sure, but easier on the budget. And that brings us to today. While torture and cruel punishment still exist in some parts of the world, we've generally agreed that maybe we should find less creative ways to handle justice. The fascinating thing? Many of our modern phrases come from these ancient punishments. Third degree, rack your brain, put them through the ringer, all references to torture methods. So next time someone says they're under the thumb, remember, at least it's just a figure of speech now. But perhaps the most important lesson from all this isn't about the punishments themselves. It's about human nature. We're capable of incredible creativity, both in causing suffering and in finding reasons to stop it. And if there's one thing this journey through history's darkest corners shows us, it's that progress isn't just about inventing new things. Sometimes, it's about looking at what we've created and having the wisdom to say, maybe we shouldn't do this anymore. Because in the end, the most powerful thing about human creativity isn't our ability to design new ways to hurt each other. It's our ability to imagine better ways to live together. And that, perhaps, is the most important punishment we've ever managed to escape: the limitation of our own cruel imagination.